I want to start off by saying this clearly. I'm not reacting to the Danny Jones podcast episode, Ancient Language Experts What the Vatican is Hiding About Jesus, because I'm threatened by it. I'm reacting to it because it matters. This episode brings together two trained people, Ammon Hillman and Luke Gorton, and it places them inside a conversation that sits at the intersection of ancient languages, history, theology, power, and institutions. That intersection deserves seriousness, not slogans. Now, let me draw an important distinction right up front. I'm not opposed to the idea that institutions, including the Vatican, have withheld, filtered, delayed, or selectively emphasized certain texts over the centuries. Anyone who knows church history, canon formation, or the politics of late antiquity knows that this isn't controversial. Institutions curate. Institutions preserve what serves continuity. Institutions suppress what destabilizes authority. That's true of churches, governments, universities, and empires. So if the claim is simply that not everything was preserved or promoted equally, I'm open to that. In fact, I'd be surprised if it weren't true. Where I begin to part ways is how that claim is argued. Ammon Hillman presents an interpretation of Jesus' early Christianity and ancient Greek language that is deliberately transgressive. It's provocative by design. It leans heavily on pharmacology, sexualized ritual language, mystery cult parallels, and a semantic reading of Greek terms that collapses genre, chronology, and context into a single interpretive lens. And here's the problem: provocation is not the same thing as proof. Hillman's argument depends on treating Greek vocabulary as if lexical possibility equals historical reality, as if the presence of a word in magical or medical texts licenses its meaning everywhere, across all genres, across centuries, and across radically different cultural contexts. That is not how historical linguistics works. That is not how philology works, and that is not how responsible scholarship works. Knowing Greek is not the same thing as using Greek correctly. Now, Luke Gorton occupies a very different position from this conversation, and I want to be fair to him. Luke operates within a recognizable academic framework. He emphasizes translation, directionality, linguistic constraints, historical probability, and methodological discipline. On those grounds, I find many of his critiques of Hillman persuasive. His insistence that words must be interpreted within genre, time frame, and social function is not apologetics, it's basic scholarship. That said, I'm not here to canonize Luke either. There are moments when he leans heavily on probability language. Likely, probably, most scholars agree. And while that's responsible academically, it can sometimes obscure how much uncertainty genuinely exists in reconstructing the ancient world. I'm still weighing his conclusions, particularly where institutional transmission, translation politics, and Second Temple diversity are concerned. So this is not a Hillman is wrong, Gorton is right video. This is a methodology video. What concerns me most about the Hillman style approach is not that it challenges orthodoxy. Challenging orthodoxy is healthy. What concerns me is that it replaces one form of authority with another, substituting ecclesiastical control with semantic maximalism, where every possible meaning becomes the intended meaning and every later magical usage becomes retroactively explanatory. That isn't liberation from dogma, it's just a different dogma. And here's the deeper issue. When you collapse language, ritual, sex, drugs, and power into a single narrative without strict controls, you don't just destabilize theology, you destabilize history itself. You make it impossible to distinguish between what could have existed and what did exist. So in this video, I'm not defending the Vatican, I'm not defending orthodoxy, and I'm not defending tradition for tradition's sake. What I'm defending is discipline. The ancient world was strange enough without us needing to exaggerate it. The real history, messy, pluralistic, political, and often uncomfortable, is already compelling. We don't need to turn Jesus into a pharmacological cipher or a mystery cult avatar to make the story interesting. We need to slow down. We need to separate possibility from probability. And we need to stop mistaking shock for insight. That's what this response is about. So all of the items in this transcript that should be addressed. So here's an exhaustive checklist of the distinct claims, assumptions, and disputes raised in the transcript that would need to be addressed, corrected, defended, or educated in any serious response. So this is just issue mapping, not rebuttal yet. Institutional and framing claims claim that the Vatican is hiding or suppressing key texts. Implicit assumption that withheld text would radically alter Jesus' history. Conflation of canon formation with intentional deception. Assumption that non-canonical equals suppressed truth. Failure to distinguish ecclesiastical politics from philological evidence. Septuagint Hebrew origins claim that Greek predates Hebrew as the Torah's source. Assertion that Hebrew is a back translation from Greek. Interpretation of Tohu Vafohu as the evidence of Greek originality, dismissal of Paleo-Hebrew evidence as speculative, skepticism towards Ketef silver amulets, claim that Paleo-Hebrew appears in isolation, argument that lack of Hebrew libraries invalidates Hebrew textual tradition, comparison of Hebrew textual survival to Greek survival as the equivalent cases, denial that destruction events plausibly explain manuscript loss. Paleo-Hebrew and archaeology, questioning whether Paleo-Hebrew is really Hebrew. Claim that letter identification is guesswork. Demand for external contemporaneous literature naming Hebrew explicitly. Argument that absence of monumental Hebrew architecture undermines literacy. Rejection of archaeological context in favor of textual abundance standards. Suggestion that inscriptions could be planted or fabricated. Language survival and cultural destruction. Claim that Hebrew culture left no literature outside the Bible. Assertion that all the Hebrew texts conveniently burned. Comparison with Persian survival as a counterexample. Claim that valid languages must be referenced by classical historians. Use of Herodotus as a standard Hebrew fails to meet. Um, Denial that oral and scribal cultures can preserve text reliably. Jesus' spoken languages claim that Jesus primarily spoke Greek. Denial or minimization of Aramaic primacy, interpretation of Aramaic quotations as later literary affectations, claim that Aramaic quotations could still be Greek constructs, assertion that Jesus studied in Alexandria, assumption that Jesus received elite Greek education, claim that Judea was linguistically insignificant, and dismissal of Galilean sociolinguistics. Aramaic quotations in the Gospels claim that Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani is not securely Aramaic. Suggestion that the phrase encodes Greek magical language, reinterpretation of sabachthani via Greek cult terminology, connection of sabachthani to chthonic deities, association with mystery religion, resurrection language, rejection of standard Semitic triliteral root analysis, methodological disputes, rejection of probability-based historical reasoning, demand for absolute certainty in ancient history, equating linguistic reconstruction with fabrication, dismissal of comparative linguistics as guessing, rejection of Proto-Indo-European methodology, mischaracterization of asterisk reconstructions, collapsing linguistics into speculation, rejection of historical linguistics as a valid science, and sounds like etymology, use of phonetic similarity to assert semantic identity, linking unrelated roots via surface resemblance, treating vowel variation as irrelevant in Greek, ignoring morphological boundaries, conflating homophony with etymology, rejecting modern linguistic constraints in favor of intuition. Christing. Claim that Christing is a primarily Greek term, treating a neologism as an ancient category, confusion between verb, participle, and noun, claim that Christos is primarily a drug term, assertion that pharmacological usage dominates the corpus, failure to distinguish metaphorical from titular usage, ignoring Hebrew messiah as a source concept, denial that Christos is a translation equivalent, and treating English inject analogy as decisive. Greek magical papyri, treating PGM as representative of everyday Greek, using late syncretistic texts as early semantic controls, collapsing magic, medicine, religion, and biography. Assuming cult vocabulary implies cult identity, treating ritual language as historical reportage, ignoring genre and audience distinctions, sex, drugs, and ritual claims. Claim that Jesus was associated with drug rituals. Claim that Christos implies sexual initiation. Invocation of explicit sexual texts as explanatory. Association with child abuse rituals. Claim that gospel arrest narratives encode cult secrecy. Claim that Jesus denied being a Laestes bandit as a cult reference. Conflation of polemic accusation with historical events. Early sources in chronology. Rejection of earlier is better historiographical principle. Equal weighting of 2nd to 4th century texts with 1st century ones. denial of mythological accretion over time, treating later accusations as original tradition, ignoring polemical motives of later authors, Jewish Greek versus normal Greek, claim that Jewish Greek is a distinct language, denial that Koine is continuous with classical Greek, assertion that classicists cannot read Koine, misrepresentation of dialect evolution, confusion between register and language. Dead Sea Scrolls and textual stability claim that Isaiah scroll matches Masoretic text word for word, counterclaim that such stability is impossible, confusion over consonantal versus vocalized text, misunderstanding Masoretic vowel tradition, failure to account for controlled scribal transmission. Canon, translation, and authority claim that the Bible translations rely solely on Masoretic text, ignorance of critical editions and apparatus, failure to distinguish translation philosophy, dismissal of multilingual textual comparison, and claim that learning Hebrew is futile if Greek is original. Rhetorical and debate tactics, shifting burden of proof mid-argument, treating skepticism as evidence, equating institutional distrust with historical accuracy, using shock value as argumentative leverage, and accusing methodological rigor of faith bias, framing disagreement as lack of courage or training. That's a total of 102. So the bottom line is the transcript is not one debate. It's over 100 separable issues, many of which cannot be resolved simultaneously because they rely on mutually incompatible methodologies. So I want to give a response from the top down using the arguments that cut the narrative at the head and move down from there. So if there is a way that two or more issues can be destroyed with one or more facts, we're going to be efficient. So the first cut, method beats scandal. Extraordinary historical claims require controls, chronology, genre, corpus representativeness, and translation direction. If an argument repeatedly violates those controls, you don't have a controversial conclusion, you have an unreliable method. This single point kills. Lexicon possibility equals historical reality, sex, drugs, Jesus. Magic papyri explain the Gospels. Not true. Late polemics reveal early truth, and sounds like etymology links. So before we argue conclusions, we have to agree on method. If the method can turn any word into anything by switching genres and centuries, it can prove whatever you want. Second cut. Hebrew predates the Septuagint, so Greek can't be the Torah original. Well, the fact is, we have Hebrew biblical text material earlier than the Septuagint, including the Ketef Hinnom amulets from the 7th century BC, which is Numbers 6, and later Hebrew biblical manuscripts at Qumran from the 3rd to the 1st century BC. The Septuagint translation tradition is typically dated to the 3rd century BC. Therefore, Greek Torah first, Hebrew later collapses. This single fact kills the argument that Hebrew is a back translation, or that Greek is the original, or Paleo-Hebrew is guesswork, therefore meaningless, because it's not just one artifact, it's a broader epigraphic and manuscript ecosystem. Genesis 1 verse 2 proves Greek priority. That's not true. So basically you can't reverse the translation direction when the source language is attested centuries earlier than the translation. Here's the third cut. Translation fingerprints. Greek reads like a translation of Hebrew, not the reverse. So the high leverage principle is that translation direction is not vibes, it leaves diagnostic residue. Unnatural retention of Hebrew and word order, idioms in Greek. Multiple Greek renderings for one Hebrew root. Interpretive expansions where Hebrew is compressed. All of this simultaneously kills the argument that the Greek is philosophically richer, so it must be original. The Hebrew is primitive, so it must be derived. Genesis 1 verse 2 is evidence of Greek metaphysics as the source. The Septuagint behaves like a translator wrestling with Hebrew, exactly what you'd expect if Hebrew is prior. The fourth cut. Corpus and genre. PGM and late polemics can't function as your semantic baseline. Here's the rule. If you use late specialized syncretistic corpora, e.g. magical handbooks, polemic heresiology, as your primary semantic control, you will distort ordinary meanings. This argument kills the idea that PGM proves what gospel words mean, or drug sex ritual meanings are primary, or Epiphanius preserves original Christianity, or hidden rights encoded in Mark arguments. you don't define normal language from the weirdest corner of the library. Fifth cut. The Christos pivot fails morphology plus Hebrew source concept. Here's the anchor facts. Christos is a Greek participle meaning anointed, from Kreo, to anoint. It is the standard Greek equivalent used to render Hebrew Mashiach, anointed one. This kills the idea that Christos primarily means drugged, sexualized initiate, or that christening is the original category, or the title is a pharmacological code, or the entire one word unlocks the conspiracy narrative. The fact is, a participle meaning anointed doesn't become a drug ritual initiate just because you can find fringe usage in later magic texts. Sixth cut. Jesus' spoken language argument, Aramaic is the default setting. High leverage background. Judea, Galilee were multilingual. Aramaic, Hebrew liturgy, Greek and commerce administration, but Aramaic was the everyday dominant language for many Jews in that region. The Gospels preserve Aramaic phrases, transliterated as noteworthy. This fact kills the idea that Jesus was primarily Greek-speaking, therefore Greek theology is original. Or the idea that Aramaic phrases are fake, late, therefore meaningless. Or the idea that Jesus must be an Alexandrian educated escalation. The actual reality is Greek presence doesn't equal Greek primacy. Preserved Aramaic phrases make the most sense if Aramaic was actually being spoken. Seventh cut. No Hebrew literature survived is not evidence of non-existence. Historical reality. The Levant experienced repeated destruction and archival loss. Survival bias is massive. We still have inscriptions, seals, ostraka, Hebrew Aramaic epigraphy, Qumran manuscript culture. This fact kills the idea that if Hebrew literature existed, we'd have Greek-style libraries, or the idea that convenient burn story proves invention, or the idea that no Herodotus mention equals no Hebrew-style arguments. The fact is that destroyed archives explain absence better than conspiracy explains everything. Final cut. Even if the Vatican did withhold books, that doesn't validate Hillman's reconstruction. So, here's the strongest charitable premise. The premise is that the Vatican has restricted or curated access to some texts. The conclusion that still does not imply that those texts say what Ammon Hillman claims, or that Ammon Hillman's semantics are correct, or that Jesus was a drug sex cult figure, or that the Torah was Greek first. So this kills the narrative leap that institutional secrecy equals Hillman is right. The fact is that suspicion about institutions is not evidence for a specific philological conclusion. So I'm open to the idea that institutions curate and sometimes suppress texts, but that doesn't make any sensational reconstruction true. The core of Hillman's argument collapses on translation, direction, and method. Hebrew biblical material is attested earlier than the Septuagint, so Greek cannot be the Torah's original language, and the Septuagint reads like a translation struggling with Hebrew idioms, not the other way around. From there, the drug-sex narrative relies on defining common words using late magical and polemical texts, genre errors that can prove anything. Christos is a plain participle meaning anointed, a translation of Hebrew Mashiach, not a pharmacological code. Even if some texts were withheld, that doesn't validate a method that jumps centuries, mixes genres, and treats lexical possibility as historical fact. If we want truth, we don't start with shock, we start with controls.